Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here today to talk to you about why more people should be interested in travel writing. Of the 196 countries in the world, I have been to just 10 of them. I want to start my presentation by asking you, where have you been to? And how would you describe that experience to somebody who wasn't there with you? Is it even possible to describe seeing the Grand Canyon or Niagara Falls or the bull runs of Pamplona? Is it possible to describe these experiences to somebody who doesn't even own a passport? Because that is a challenge that travel writers find themselves experiencing every single time they pick up their pen. They have to think, how can I make my experiences understandable, interesting, and relevant for an audience who doesn't come from the same background as me? Travel writing is an interesting topic for me because it gives you the opportunity to escape from a gloomy Glasgow afternoon and to visit places that I might never get the chance to physically experience myself. Before I go any further into what travel writing can do, it would be a good chance to introduce a definition of what travel writing is. Notoriously difficult, but for the sake of my presentation, I want to narrow travel writing down to a book or an article narrating a journey the writer went on themselves. And so it should be true in as far as any autobiography is true, and not just one person's version of events. Travel writing is arguably the oldest genre of literature that we have today. The Odyssey could be considered an example of travel writing. And yet, despite this, it's only as late as the 1990s that we began to consider that travel writing could also be an interesting area of critical study. The tendency, as Raban, who is both a critic and a travel writer, has noted, is that we tend to see travel writing as just a factual account. It's useful if you're going the same way and you want hotel recommendations or to know what's the best season to go. But it's not literary. It's not real literature in the same way that a poem or a play is considered real literature. And yet, as Raban points out, travel writing can be incredibly complex. It uses a lot of the same formal and narrative structures that we see in fiction in order to turn a series of apparently unrelated events into a single narrative story. I thought we'd begin with an extract from Thoreau. Don't worry, this is, I think, the longest single block of text I'm inflicting on anyone today. I chose Thoreau because he's one of the big names of travel writing. In fact, the Old Patagonian Express, which is the one I've picked out for you today, has recently been republished as a Penguin Modern Classic and was called one of the most entrancing books of travel written in our decade. Which is quite a claim, as is the claim that's been made that Thoreau is unusual in that he's particularly sympathetic and he has an understanding of the Latin American people he visited that most travel writers don't have. Yet, that description strikes me as odd. If we look specifically at the first part, where it says, the garlic seller was the personification of Latin America. He was weedy and wore a torn shirt and greasy hat. He was very dirty and screamed the same words over and over. This struck me as immediately suspect. The personification of Latin America? Firstly, what gives Thoreau the right to decide this? But also, what is it about this man and this description that he thinks is quintessentially Mexican? We might say, well, this was written in the late 1970s. Things have changed. And indeed they have. But for me, that is also the point. Travel writing is interesting for me because it captures our idea of other cultures at a very specific moment. It captures who we think other countries are when we write it. And these ideas change, but only so that they're replaced with different ideas. It's my theory that if the Old Patagonian Express was being written now, the picture would be quite different. Perhaps, given America's recent fears about immigration, the stereotypical Mexican might be a surly drug cartel member or a family of 11 children trying to sneak their way past the Mexican border. The other interesting thing about travel writing is it captures both our ideas of who other cultures are and our idea of who we are. So in this description, we see that Thoreau constructs an idea of America primarily through contrast. And that's really common for travel writing. In fact, all travel writing relies on some level, implicitly or explicitly, upon comparisons. In order to say these people are foreign and these people are exotic, different, erotic, we specify in how they're different from us. So we are like this, they are like this. And we see that in this passage when American is constructed as the opposite. So America is clean, sanitary, stable, and Mexico is chaotic and wild. I began to think, and this was some weeks into my research, that perhaps we can take this a step further than we already have done. Perhaps travel writing could be considered as not just a passive reflection of the world, but what if travel writing could be involved in actively shaping the world? And for Hume, that's exactly what we have. For him, travel writing is a way of commenting on the wider political situation. It's a way of questioning what we think we know about other cultures. I decided to do my dissertation on the travel writing produced immediately after World War II, because for me, World War II was such a cataclysmic event that the world that followed would have to necessarily be different from the one that came before. And travel writing, like every other genre of literature, was likely to have a lot to say about what the future of the world was going to be. And indeed, that's exactly what I found when I started researching it. I found that the travel writers of the 1950s had no qualms about getting involved in some of the most tense, most controversial political issues of their decade. For example, the rising Cold War tensions. John Steinbeck is a name that some of us will be familiar with from classroom studies. I know we studied him in my high school. But it's less known that he wrote travel writing as well. It was his belief that conflict was caused by ignorance, by a lack of understanding of other cultures. And so he went to the Soviet Union in 1948. It was a journey which wouldn't be possible even a few years, perhaps even a few months after he went. He went at a very specific historical moment where tensions were beginning to rise, but while there was still a chance that a better relationship could be found between America and the Soviet Union. So through his narrative, he was keen to point out all the ways in which our stereotypes, what we think we know, are totally and utterly wrong. So he was keen to point out the similarities as opposed to the differences between the people that he met in the Soviet Union and his American friends and family back home. By doing this, he encouraged his readers to see the way in which we are similar, to transcend cultural differences and realize that we're all part of the same world. Martha Gellhorn is another really interesting figure. She was a journalist and a war reporter, and to illustrate her character, I want to share a brief anecdote. On D-Day, there was exactly one woman there, and that was Martha Gellhorn. She was refused permission to report on D-Day, so she snuck aboard a British boat and went anyway. She followed her story wherever it went, and during the 1960s, she wrote a series of articles traveling through America, trying to find the spirit of America, trying to find what it means to be American. And wherever she went, she found and she reported on injustices. It was the opinion of polite society that these things like the lynchings happened, but we didn't talk about them. Nobody in polite society talked about lynchings, but she did. She consistently wrote about all the things that society would have rather ignored, and in doing so, she demonstrated that travel writing is a way not just to talk about the relationship between countries, but between groups within a country. And so she caused us to re-examine the way we treat the most vulnerable members within our own society. Simone De Beauvoir is another name that some people know from philosophy and from feminist literary criticism, but she only wrote in her lifetime a single book of travel writing, which is the one we have here, America Day by Day. It's an account of 4 months spent traveling through America and reporting on what she sees. She was largely quite scathing. She noticed a lot of young people seem to feel like the country is too big, that there's too many people, and that there's nothing that they themselves can do to change anything. But that went completely against everything she believed in. She wrote her travel log as a call to arms, as an insistence for those who read it that they are part of the world and that they can change it. Which brings me to my favorite Simone de Beauvoir quote. The present is not a possible past, but the moment of choice and opportunity. She wrote this in Paris in the late 1940s. She lived through the occupation. She lived through us becoming aware of the true extent of the atrocities and the Holocaust. She was not naive to the terrible things that people do to each other, but she believed that we could be better than we had been before. And that's what really good travel writing does. It causes us to question if we really understand other nations. It causes us to try and understand more about the world that we live in. It causes us to question how we treat people within our own country. So, if we want travel writing which engages with the world, then perhaps we have to demand it. We have to demand more than top 5 romantic destinations for Valentine's Day 2015. We have to read travel writing, and as we read it, think, does what I'm reading have the potential to reimagine the world? Thank you.
I was interested, it's actually a sort of comparison between what you're saying, what the previous speaker was saying, because Martin was talking about how when you draw things you fictionalise, and I wonder whether you felt the same with travel writing, how much is reportage and journalism, and how much is sort of, how truthful can travel writing be in the same way just because you draw is fiction, is writing the same?
Well, it's a really good point. I think with travel writing, like autobiography, there is always somewhat an element of fiction. You're reading what the writer wants you to read. And the Steinbeck one is quite a good example of that, because a Russian journal has not received incredibly favourable reviews from a lot of critics. I think they think that his propagandic point has somewhat overwhelmed his writing. So I think that's really, I would argue, it's not about choosing one over the other, but being aware that when you're reading a piece of travel writing, you are reading something which is filtered through somebody's eyes, and that they're going to have their own opinions, and that these opinions can be quite strong and can quite clearly affect what you read. But with travel writing, as I think with all non-fictional genres, there's a tendency to think like what you're reading is fact. I wouldn't go as far to say it's fictionalized. I think like comic books, so I don't know if Martin will agree with this, I'd say that probably takes the fictionalizing a bit further, but it's certainly very tinted.
I wanted to hear your opinion about what kind of current events do you think could shape travel writing now? You know how you said in the past there was the propaganda of the Cold War and the Soviets and things like that. What about the current events? Is there something that if someone was to write a travel writing book that they could write about, potentially could change people's opinions?
One that I think would be quite interesting and hasn't happened yet is I would be quite interested to read more travel writing about Afghanistan and the Middle East. There's been some published in recent years, but the problem is so much of the country is non-accessible that what has been produced is often based a lot on newspaper reports and stuff like that, which doesn't get quite to the centre of things. If things become calmer in the area and there's more accessible travel, I think it'd be quite interesting to read more travel writing which tries to take a new look at that. I know there's some critics which have actually seen 9/11 as a parallel of Hiroshima in the sort of sudden destruction. So I think we're too close to it to tell quite yet, but I'd be quite interested to see in 10, 15 years what people have to say and what parallels people can see.
I'm curious if you've read any non-Western travel writing, because I think there's definitely the danger of obviously reading something that can come from one perspective. And so naturally, like the critiques you had about how Mexicans are being described and how people from different cultures are being described, if it basically comes from an all-Western perspective, how do you then really delve into what is being said about other people's cultures? There obviously isn't much, arguably isn't much truth to it. So have you read anything that's non-Western?
I'm afraid not. I tried to find non-Western travel writing, but it is unfortunately a very Western-dominated genre, as you're picking up on. So I tried to combat that by being more interrogative of the Western perspective than taking it as facts. So I would love there to be more non-Western travel writing, and if you find some, let me know. But I think for the meantime, my sort of compromise has been to be as critical as possible of the standard Western view and try and find the spaces in which we can say, oh, that's probably not how they were seeing this.
So somebody has asked, does travel writing look the same or serve the same purpose in contemporary writing?
Is this you, Stephen? It's a really interesting question. Unfortunately, I think it would require a larger study than I have had, because there's a lot of new technological factors which affect how we find out information about travel writing and about travel. Because I'd be quite interested to see how people bring in things like TripAdvisor and blogs and sort of short informative pieces. My understanding is that travel writing now has taken somewhat of an inward turn, so that we go to the internet for the facts of going to a place, and then we go to travel writing more for analysis of how we respond to places. So we have books like Eat, Pray, Love and Wild, which have become far more about the subjective human experience. I remember when I read Eat, Pray, Love, it occurred to me that most of the sections could have been written anywhere. There's nothing really nationally specific. While it's not my area of expertise, my understanding is that that is the way in which travel writing is going, to become more personal and less place-based.
Somebody has asked, do you consider social media such as Instagram or Facebook with sufficient words in their post could be recognised as a kind of travel writing?
It's again a great question. That's where I was sort of going with the last one, that it's certainly been affecting how we see it. I'm not sure if Instagram is quite enough words, but certainly a longer post, like blogs, are definitely travel writing. I would say it's hard in a certain amount of words to capture to really capture an experience. It's more along the lines of photojournalism than travel writing specifically.